Hello, and welcome back to our summer series of Technically Speaking. I'm very excited to have everyone back so we can talk more about performance levers. We have a very special guest again today. We have Shannon Kerlick from our Solutions Architecture team joining us to talk about caching. Shannon, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Dara. Thanks for having us. I have been a solution architect for quite a while now, and so I'm really looking forward to this topic. It's something certainly near and dear to a lot of architects' hearts: performance, how to make it a little better, how to make our applications perform well. And I really appreciate your series, Dara. This is great. I'm looking forward to watching the rest of it myself. So thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Anytime. I know we're talking about caching, but what is caching?
Yeah, great question, of course, to start off with. One of the things about performance that we always notice is getting my data, getting access to whatever backend systems I need as quick as I can. That sometimes is a problem with databases. I know you talked to Craig some time back about data storage techniques and the architecture itself of data storage. So we definitely have a place we want to store the data for its permanent record. But when we're in an application, we sometimes need to have sort of fast access to that data locally in some way. And so that's what caching is all about. It's kind of like traveling. You may, at your house, you may have a full wardrobe. You have a nice little set of computer accessories or a toolkit or whatever it is you travel with, whatever you use day to day, rather. But when you travel, you have to pick and choose what you need to work with that day. Whether you're going across the street to the neighbor's house, you may just take maybe an outdoor game or some sort of food or beverage. Or if you're going cross country, well, you need to pack a bag and the things you need in it and that sort of stuff. So that's a little bit what caching is about. It's having the stuff you need, the data you need at the time you need it with your applications.
And are there different types of caching that we might consider?
Sure, of
Choices
course.
we can make.
Yeah, absolutely. So for an application, a lot of it depends on your needs. So you may do caching for the purpose of improving performance solely, of course, but you also may want to have an application that can operate disconnected offline. So you're not connected to the network all the time with your application, or you may have needs for just making sure that it's resilient in certain situations that you have, let's say, a imperfect network connection, as I'm sure no one's used to. And so in those different scenarios, you have different approaches, different techniques that you would use, as well as decisions about how you cache the data you're interested in. For example, typically reference data, such as the list of states, as Craig was talking about at one point, those things don't change. And so having that sort of reference data very available, very local to me, really can speed process up rather than sort of going back and asking a backend API service or something of that nature for that same data that you're using frequently. I cache that locally in some way, right? So a read-only reference data cache is very common. We see that in a lot of different applications, and it's just an excellent way to speed things up and no need for sort of network chatter and that sort of stuff with a read-only reference data cache. The other purpose would be, of course, like something like an offline application where I do need to write some data out and I want to be able to schedule that in some way, write that back to the back end at some later time, perhaps, or I'm sort of working through a process where I'm collecting a bigger set of data and I don't want to constantly write back and forth, let's say, to the back end server database, but rather store that somewhat locally and then write it all at once, for example. So those types of write back caches is also a common approach to solving that problem.
And are there different options once we've decided we want to cache some part of the data? What are the options in Unqork that we can use to create that cache?
Absolutely. So a lot of our customers, a lot of people that use Unqork have backend systems of various types. Maybe they're existing systems that their company uses. Maybe they're a public service from some big company like Google or otherwise that they might need to reference. And constantly going back and forth to those services, as I mentioned, can be sort of a costly, time-consuming thing that you don't necessarily need to do all the time. And so a very common approach that we've used in different applications in Unqork is to take some of that reference data and write it directly into our local Unqork database as either a submission or a data collection. So those who are familiar with those topics can understand what I'm talking about. But simply put, we're storing it in the server so that we can access it a little quicker, right? We go back to the Unqork environment, we get the data without having to go to the remote service every time to get that data. So storing it in a submission or a data collection is a very common practice in our applications. And next, we would might also take on use some of the existing platform capabilities that I'm sure some of your watchers will be familiar with, such as global variables. And a little secret tidbit is the user object itself. So when I'm logged in, I have a user object that's passed along with me in my session. It's somewhat similar to a session-like object. And so I can actually write some important data there, especially user preferences, things like that, that I might otherwise have to constantly go back and forth to the database or some service to get. I can store those things in the user object itself, and that makes it really easy to get to it quickly. So those are probably the two most common uses of caching in the platform. Another bit that's kind of an emerging thing that we've been working on a lot lately is using the browser storage component. So the browser storage component is an excellent tool for the write back and the read-only and write-back caches, I should say, in both cases. That's a really great component to be able to make use of these things. It works directly in the browser. It's really interesting. It gives you a database that's completely local to the browser. And the structure of it is very similar to, it's very familiar to Unqork users from the submissions interface. And so I can actually write submissions to this component. I can read and write from it in my applications modules. And we've used this for, like I said, read-only type caching, where I can pull in a big chunk of data from a submission in the back end and keep it local. Having said big chunk, I should qualify that to say, of course, you are storing it in the browser, so you don't want to put millions of rows of data in the user's browser. But for simpler use cases, it makes a lot of sense and can really speed things up. So we've been using that frequently, and it's pretty interesting.
That's great. When you were talking about the user object, I was thinking about some of the projects that I worked on that I didn't even think about it as caching, that we were storing preferences with the user object to make sure that we had everything we needed and didn't need to go back or figure out where it was. So you mentioned a couple of things, the user object, you talked about either creating a submission or a data collection, and browser storage. What are the pros to using each of these options? When are they appropriate?
Right. Excellent question. So I would say that there are a combination of pros and cons for each one, and you might also think of a hybrid of all of them in some cases. So let's talk about that a little bit. For using a submission or a data collection in the platform, the pro is it's very easy to manage, right? It's very easy to get data from these external services and write it into a submission in our Unqork database. But it's likewise, it's on the server. So now in order to get that data, I would have to go to the server and get it. So if I'm in a browser situation where I am frequently going back and forth to the server, it may not be as optimal as having it more local, let's say. But again, its primary advantages are ease of use, sort of natural support within the platform for most folks. Very easy for us to understand how to use it and consume it within the application. With the downside being that it is still on the server. So I'd have to go back to the server in some cases to get it, et cetera. For the user object, the plus side, as you mentioned, is that it's immediately available pretty much anywhere the user is logged in. And that's a really great feature to have. The downside is you clearly don't want to store a lot of data in this object, because you will be passing it around to each page you go to. So you want to limit it to simpler things, preferences, role-based settings, for example, things of that nature that make sense that you might normally have to go back and forth to the server on, and so on. The other downside to it, I would say, is that it does require a user that might be logged in through SSO to create a temporary object in the environment. So sometimes that's something that customers are concerned about, but it's a very secure setup. So it works really well in my experience to use that user object in that way. On the browser storage component, I would say it has a lot of positives, including very fast, very much able to be used across different applications. kind of directly integrated in the platform in a nice way, which is all really great positives. And the only real negative is essentially it is a little more complicated to understand in how I might manage that cache locally, such as keeping it fresh. I need to make sure I go back and forth to the server every once in a while, at least perhaps for a read-only reference cache, to make sure I have current information or whatever. And in the case of using it for writing data back, I would need to be able to synchronize that and have the process to synchronize that to a backend data store, or whatever that may be, whether it's the Unqork database or some external service. I need to have that bit of configuration added into it. But again, it's well integrated in the platform, so it's not terribly hard to do. It's just something to consider.
And I think one other thing that you and I had chatted about is also with the user-based storage. It's then tied to the user. So something like the 50
Right.
states, you may not want to tie to
Right.
every single user. But if you're looking at preferences, you're looking at history, things that they may have done, that may make sense to store with that
Right.
particular user.
Very good point. Yeah, that's a good sort of breakdown of when do I use which and so on. It really is very specific to your application as to what would be the best option. And to your point, absolutely, things like the user object doesn't make a lot of sense to store big global things like that. And we have global variables for a lot of that. We also have the data collections and the submissions that are optimal for that sort of and we've certainly used that quite a bit in the past to work with. And on the browser storage side, it really is a specific use that makes sense. Again, you don't want to store a large data set necessarily, but you can store a fair amount of data in that object as you see fit. But it's, again, the complexity of is the use case really warrant that extra step of putting in that complexity? Let's say maybe not, but yeah, very good points.
Any other rules of thumb or things that the team should be thinking about when they're thinking about how to get data closer to them rather than from a client system or external system?
Right. Great point. Great question. I think one thing that we didn't touch on yet, but is very critical to keep in mind, is the security of that data. You don't want to create a situation where you're lowering or changing the security profile, let's say, of the backend data systems you're using. In other words, if one user, if it requires a particular role of user, let's say, to access a particular type of data, you want to make sure you carry that forward into your data, your cache, whether that's stored in the submission or stored in the user object. Typically, you want to make sure that you don't lower that security setting and are properly, let's say, expiring things that should be expired according to the policy of the product you were trying to build. So those are really key points to consider. And but I mentioned this earlier. I think the hybrid approach is probably even more common now, and that we want to use a little bit of all of those tools for our convenience. In some cases, customers may not want to permanently store data in the Unqork database for some reason or the other. And but we know it's going to perform a lot better if we temporarily store that data. And so we'll work out a situation where we do store data, for read and write purposes, for read-only caching, all those sorts of things in the Unqork database. But then we periodically, or perhaps when the process is done, delete that data and write it back to the target system, let's say, target environment, and then remove that data from the Unqork database in some periodic way, whether it's immediately or it's let's say daily or something like that. So that is a very frequent use of that approach for data that needs to be somewhat transient and cached in an Unqork submission. And again, likewise, we want to be careful that we expire data in the user object or the browser storage component, whichever we're using, and in a timely fashion to make sure it gets refreshed, through whatever process you would normally use to refresh those things. So size-wise, I would clarify user object and things like that. Keep it small. Global variables, user object. Keep those data sets very small. Something that you really need constantly, that you don't want to have to constantly go get that one value back from the back end. Browser storage, somewhere in the medium there, something particularly relevant to that user, but also could be that list of 50 states, certainly could be a good use for that. And then on the Unqork submission side, it's pretty much anything you need to access quickly and don't want to have to wait and go back to a remote API or something of that nature to get that data. You need to get there quickly. So it's a good option. Good option.
Absolutely. Shannon, any last thoughts on caching that you want to share with the team?
Well, now I've made myself want to travel. So think about that when you're traveling next. You're caching your goods for your your travel across.
Absolutely. Thinking about a backpack, a carry-on, something that's checked, or kind of thinking about those levels of caching of how quickly do I need it?
Right.
How often am I going to grab it?
It's a definite exercise in optimization. You don't need that extra bag if you think about it, right? Or maybe you do.
Absolutely. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. And as you go on your summer travels, make sure you're considering how you're caching everything you're packing. And we look forward to seeing you not next week because of the holiday, but the following week as we continue to go through different performance levers that we can pull.
Thanks.